Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second instalment of EFA Talks. My name is Angus Murray. I'm the chair of Electronic Frontiers Australia's Policy Committee. And this afternoon, I have the pleasure to be joined by Lucie Krahulcova, and I apologise if I've mispronounced that, Lucie, from Access Now. Lucie is a policy analyst and professional activist for digital rights with the organisation Access Now. Currently, she's based in Melbourne, where she supports the Asia Pacific team, as well as working on national legislation. She's trying to fix Australia's broken relationship with encryption, surveillance, and privacy. Prior to her current role, she spent 4 years working for Access Now in Brussels in an effort to get EU rules that protect the rights of users at risk. She's also a board member of Digital Rights Watch, a contributing member of the World Economic Forum's Global Council on Consumption, and a volunteer digital rights security trainer. I've had the great pleasure of appearing in parliamentary and Senate committees with Lucie, and it's always a pleasure to watch her passionately express concern with some of the legislation that's passed over the last couple of years and very eloquently describe the international frameworks that we sit around. So it's great to have you here, Lucie. Thank you. I thought I might start this off in that same vein, the context that we're in at the moment, it being a fairly busy year for digital rights. And in the space that you are with Access Now, I'm sure you've been on your toes. It might be useful to do a slightly more eloquent job than I have to explain a bit about yourself and the work that Access Now does. Can you tell us a bit about Access Now?
Hey, yeah, and thank you for inviting me to EFA Talks. I was here last week for, well, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, for Siletz. And I think it's just a super useful format since we're all sitting at home to kind of come to these spaces and have these discussions instead of just having little rants at each other on Twitter. So I like the context of seeing people face to face. So I work for Access Now, which has been really a great growing experience for me over the past few years. And yeah, I come from an EU background, so everything I kind of look at through a lens of where EU and US policy sits, and that's been extremely useful since moving down here. And prior to my, move, I sort of pitched, look, I'm moving to Australia kind of for personal family reasons, and it was just a unified consensus to have someone for Access Now on the ground because the digital security environment here is so shaky. So we really wanted to see how we can help support the digital rights infrastructure. And I think we've done a great job at working together within these little forums and groups. So I'm very happy that I'm able to deliver on that a bit. Access Now, for those unfamiliar, and hello everybody who's joined us, thank you very much. Access Now is a digital rights NGO. We have about, I think, something like 70 staff globally now, which is super exciting. One of the key things we do is we have a 24-hour, 7 days a week helpline. So that's based in the Philippines, in Tunisia, and in Costa Rica. So we cover all the time zones, and they're just there to either do like proactive threat modeling and support people in developing digital security and securing their devices, or sort of reactive stuff, when devices get confiscated by law enforcement or crossing borders, or profiles get taken down. So we are sort of in that framework, and we can help people with all sorts of queries. And then on top of that, we've built our sort of advocacy campaigning arm. We've built our policy arm, which is where I sit. And we as well have a grants program and now a budding legal team. So it's really an exercise in trying to take the lessons that we learn sort of through the helpline and on ground work, and making sure that, we more actively contribute to shaping the world and policies. Whew, that's like a longer version of the elevator pitch. But yeah, and we also organize RightsCon, which this year has been moved due to circumstances, of course. I think it might be virtual, so keep an eye out for that. There might be a very cool Human Rights in the Digital Age conference that you can watch from the comfort of your living rooms, which I think is really cool. Did I answer your question? I feel like I did.
Yeah, it's a big organisation, and I think interplayed into digital rights is obviously the digital environment, and that now being an international stage. I think rights-based organisations like Access Now that do cover the whole globe are particularly important. Myself, having studied in Stockholm, Sweden, and having interesting comparisons drawn through that process between the European Union, the US, and Australia, I had a description given to me of the difference between the three blocks, if I could put it that way. The first being in the European Union, people are afraid of government. People are afraid of corporations. The US, people are afraid of government. And in Australia, we have no idea what to be afraid of. I think that as we continue down this path, that kind of messaging is amplified, that in Australia we might have not quite followed this, and maybe we're afraid of not following it at the same time as afraid of following it. But there's a concept that comes into that in terms of how government's watching us, how corporations are watching us. And I understand you've termed that, or it's been termed, surveillance capitalism. What's your thoughts on that, surveillance capitalism or commodification of surveillance?
Yeah, I think, that term was coined a while ago, but it's something that I think just constantly resurfaces. And right now is like a particularly good time to think about it. I think Australia, along with a couple of other countries, really grapple with how to regulate tech adequately. And it's just something they err on the side of not taking action rather than, being seen as hampering innovation or somehow meddling where they shouldn't. And I think it's a real shame. And so not only are they sort of failing in their regulatory role and figuring out a system, that protects the rights of individuals in this very digital era of hyper social media, but I think they're also failing in their then responses to that. And they actually see it as a vehicle to piggyback on, to sort of say, oh, well, if you're building all this infrastructure, if you're, if people have these devices, why can't the government stuff be built on top of that? And I think that's the sort of twisted relationship that is highlighted in a situation like now with the pandemic, where the government, is saying, well, people have devices, there's an app store, why don't we just, provide a solution based on that? And there's quite a few issues with that. One, as the government, this is not, the tools of the open market don't belong to you, but moreover, it really threatens individual rights. It also fails completely in the government's role of inclusion, because for especially people who are on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, for various vulnerable groups, you have Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders, kind of communities here. Those people just will not have the same access to either, new and modern technologies, or they won't necessarily have the same understanding. I think that's something that the government totally overlooks. And it bothers me when they talk about this going back to normal, just install the app, we can go back to the pubs, go back to restaurants. I think they've really forgotten to look at people who aren't in that, God, I hate using this word, but who aren't in the zeitgeist of these technologies. And matter of factly, those are some of the most vulnerable people. So it strikes me as odd that they haven't really thought about what happens. And even beyond that, there's a lot of activists who don't have these phones for different reasons. In our space, people just don't trust having that technology in their pocket. So I haven't seen them address it. I think New Zealand has a little bit started thinking about that. They've started thinking of putting that Bluetooth beacon in a card rather than have it on someone's device. And I think just that sort of thinking of, we can't rely on people having this technology or actually wanting to sign up a privately owned piece of technology to a public operated program. I think that's the kind of thinking a government should be having when they, try to address a solution. But yeah, the risks of riding on the back of surveillance capitalism are huge, because you're not only not regulating the tech companies adequately, you're piling on the issue. And I think you and I, when we did the testimony over TOLA, that's one of the things, sorry everyone for using an acronym, Telecommunications and Other Legislations Amendment, or the Assistance and Access Bill, which seeks to undermine encryption, it's the same principle, right? Instead of the government seeking new ways and tools to do investigations, they see, oh, well, people are interacting in this private space. How do we take control of that? And how do we operate within it? Rather than actually finding a separate fix, and while also making sure that space is protected and secure. So it's a failure that kind of compounds, and I think you and I have seen it play out already.
It's a very difficult situation because it sits on the back, as you've very eloquently said, sits on the back of technology, which has very rapidly been developed. And there isn't really a social understanding of that technology. And at a probably more technical level, there isn't a technical understanding of the technology that's widespread. There's a convenience, and on that convenience, various platforms can be propped up or built, like government tracing apps, or the ability to target political messaging to people, which in my mind creates a problem. A problem predominantly, in my view, of the norms that create society and the fabric that means us as individuals organising in a collective and working towards some goal. We've had a couple of questions come through the chat and what you've said, and this is obviously a very live topic, so addressing a couple of those questions. I don't pose this to Lucie because I'm happy to answer this myself. I personally have not downloaded the app. I am of a belief that in a democratic society, people should be able to exercise their own choice. This is a choice that's become politicised, and I would say that alone is a reason not to download the app. In addition to that, at a fundamental level, this app should not be mandatory. There should never have been discussion about the app being mandatory. And as Lucie's just alluded to, there are other solutions that may more adequately address the issue that's attempting to be solved by government. In terms of what Electronic Frontiers Australia does, you're looking at one example of what Electronic Frontiers Australia does. We host forums like this, but broadly, Electronic Frontiers Australia is a not-for-profit organisation that's been around for more than 25 years, promoting and protecting Australians' digital rights. And that's done in formats like this, as Lucie was speaking before about giving testimony to parliamentary inquiries, giving evidence and writing submissions to parliamentary and Senate inquiries, and hosting public events like video screenings or information sessions, attending RightsCon and speaking at those kind of events. There are a couple of questions then that I think I could roll into one broad question for you, Lucie. And from your perspective, taking the international lens to this, are there governments or bodies that are addressing the COVID situation better than others? And what are some of the tell signs of a better solution or a better approach, if there are better solutions or approaches?
Cool. I'll start with the question about the app because you answered it. So I'm going to put myself on the chopping block next to you. I haven't installed it, and I'm not planning to immediately. I think, and the reason is couplefold. One of the things is I think, as with any digital security threat modeling, I would encourage you to look at your own sort of situation and what makes sense for you. I work from home by default. I have been isolating very well. I go out to groceries once a week, and my biggest interaction is picking up a bag of food from some nearby restaurants. So for me, that's just not a huge need. I think if there are people who need to operate in a lot of public spaces where they have contact with a lot of unknown people, like not just friends and family, you might come across strangers. I think that makes a lot more sense. I'm just not ready to concede that digital contact tracing is sort of the way we need it to go in the first place. So, and I definitely don't think it makes sense for someone like me who sits at home to have that app running in the background. It just doesn't, but make that decision for yourself. I know that's confusing because there's a lot of very contradicting opinions about it. Just on contact tracing, we released before I dive into that question, sort of the broader international question, Angus, we did a paper yesterday on accessnow.org, you can find it there, about contact tracing apps specifically. And it kind of has a do and don'ts approach of what you can look for when you assess sort of your own threat model. But also one of, the big thing about the intro is maybe digital contact tracing isn't the way this needed to go. And this is something that worries me always. Governments are really quick to jump on a digital solution. It's called techno-solutionism in policy circles. It just, you can imagine how that conversation went. Someone said, oh, we could definitely solve this with an app. It will be cheaper than hiring the manpower. It will be, easier. It'll be centralized. It'll be intuitive. And meanwhile, there's a lot of, I think, studies and discussion now about how manual contact tracing is actually a lot more, it is more burdensome for sure. but it's a lot more accurate. It doesn't create the sort of false positives and false negatives that app will inadvertently have. For people who are not familiar with what that means, is it will flag a lot of people as potentially having the virus who haven't had that extensive contact with you, and it will flag a lot of people. It won't flag a lot of people who maybe should be more aware because, I don't know, you sneezed around them, even though that contact was shorter. So that's something that manual contact tracers are trained to ask and to do and to assess, which is why the digital app should be like complementary. So this whole framing that we get our society back the moment we all install the app is super flawed. It's not preventative. Like, people should still be concerned. There's a lot we don't know about the virus. And all that this enables is like efficacy, theoretically, efficacy in doing the contact tracing bit, in seeing where and how the infection spreads, which is super vital data. But it just, look at that with like an eye of what else is the government doing to make sure we're all safe as we wait for the vaccine and cures and everything else to come along. International space, right? That's where I was going to be headed with this. Are there good examples? I'm not super sure. I think New Zealand maybe one of like the better examples, just because I always find, and there was a webinar that we did with Internet NZ. I think you can find the results of that online if anyone's like curious. But one of the things that I love that happens in New Zealand is they have this conversation with a lot of different communities, and they're able to pull in a lot of very versatile experts, from just different strata of society, which makes for a very wholesome discussion. And one of the things that they're mindful of, is not just, yes, people want to go back to normal life, but there's huge communities that don't necessarily see that need. They really just want to be, secure, and they want to stay healthy. And there've been like roadblocks created, and those communities are self-isolating. So they're really mindful of the actual individual little factions of society. And I think a lot of other countries, they're just kind of looking at the median. This is like the middle, upper class, middle family, probably someone with a house and a garden and a kid or two and, a car. And I think that's a real shame because, again, the most vulnerable people are the ones this solution is modeled for. But that's what we're seeing kind of everywhere in the globe. Governments are just like, how to get the economy back out, how to get people, to their appointments. And gosh, I want that too. But I also want the government to think about, what does resuming life for the elderly look like, who are increasingly more isolated. I've had a few, grandparents of friends die in the past week, and it's been heartbreaking because no one's able to be there with them. And so, I know that there are especially state level governments who are actively thinking about this, but at the federal level and at the international level, not a lot of countries are prioritizing these sort of vulnerable groups. And I think that's really tragic. We've seen really horrible examples internationally. And I think Australia isn't the worst when it comes to the contact tracing app. So I think that's commendable. In Israel, for instance, you've had the court actually rule that the sort of tracking the government was using was illegal. It violated people's rights. So I think we're going to see a little bit more of that now in Europe as people kind of, get a first breath and sense of, oh, okay, wait, this is where we're moving now. And the solutions can exist and still be rights respecting, which I think was something that, at least in the beginning, was kind of like, you're gonna have to give up your privacy. You're gonna have to give up, any sense of control over your data and your autonomy and your choices in order for us to get through this. And I think now people are saying, well, it's gonna be a good year, maybe a little longer, and we want those things, and we can find a solution that respects that and still helps us tackle the virus. So I guess the New Zealand example is the one I would lift out a little bit, which is great because Jacinda Ardern is now in discussion with the Australian government. So I'm very hopeful about that interaction and what it might mean.
I think it's particularly good when we have international discussions with states that are setting a good example. rather than international discussions of states that maybe aren't the best example or have a different motivation in terms of trade relations and legislation that might come into Australia through trade agreements that affects Australians that we don't appreciate when those discussions are happening. And the very pointed target I'm taking there is the United States and the Australia-USA Free Trade Agreement, which changed our law quite significantly without a lot of people actually really appreciating that that's what was happening in the course of trade negotiations. There are a couple of questions at the time, which I think are excellent questions, and I encourage people to keep asking questions because that's what this forum is for. One of the questions is, in your opinion, how widely is the view "I don't trust government" held in Australia? And another question that ties into that is, what are good examples or points for alerting Australians to the risks of expanding surveillance? So I'm not putting Lucie on the spot. In my view, I don't trust government is not a widely held sentiment. I think the wider held sentiment is, I don't have any reason not to trust government. And that's probably because the majority of people don't feel the direct touch of adverse government action. It's more the people in class situations that aren't able to respond to issues, like the robo-debt scenario, that people might feel angst towards government. The good examples of alerting people to the risks of expanding surveillance ties into that. So just because the majority of people don't feel or have themselves subjected to an adverse norm held by government doesn't mean that surveillance won't allow that to creep and more people are subjected to that issue in the future. From my perspective, alerting people to expanding surveillance is best achieved by, is this a world that you'd like to give to your grandchildren? So in the future, do our grandchildren deserve a world, or does current issues warrant a world where people are tracked from birth to keep themselves safe? So you give up the right to privacy, the right to free association, to an extent the right to free speech, to keep people safe. And if that was something you're giving directly to the future, is that something you'd be comfortable doing? I think a lot of people would have a degree of trepidation about that, or at least about who was tracking them and how certain you were that it was for a good cause. Lucie, do you have a view on the state of trust for the Australian government? Is there a reason not to trust the Australian government?
What a small question. I mean, yeah, I think it's an interesting question. As you say, a lot of people exactly have that sentiment, oh, I don't have a reason not to. But that bit where people don't trust the government, they really fiercely don't trust the government. So even though that's not a huge number of the population, it is a very committed, very adamant, amount of the population, either because they have been hurt by the government, or because they have enough empathy and have worked with the communities that have been hurt by the government. And that's something that's that legacy of the police state kind of interfering, even in environmental protests, in the 80s and 90s, very violently, that has stayed with that generation. And so actually, I think there's this huge kind of amount of people in their sort of 50s, 60s who are extremely adamant about, I don't trust the government, for those reasons. Trust is not something you can demand at will. And I think it's kind of ironic that the government now is kind of throwing their hands up and saying, but why won't you trust us with your data? And when I read the legislation that backs the app, I actually kind of chuckled to myself, because it might be one of the strongest privacy worded pieces of legislation I have seen, definitely that I've seen in Australia. It's very adamant about the data not being shared in any way with anyone, no investigations, no one can get their hands on it, and it's funny because it shows us that language, despite what they may say in other places, that language could have been baked into anything, and you're getting into a place where where the kind of health data protection legislations at the state levels aren't as strong as what's kind of, backing this app in a very privacy kind of sense of the word. And so, yeah, I think it's just showing to us this could have been done. We just chose not to do it. And I think that's insulting. I also think just because you're putting out a legislation to support a measure that you want, I'm happy, I'm delighted that legislation is strong, and there are small tweaks that need to be made, but it's setting a really strong precedent. But the reality is there's a structural issue that you're not addressing, right? And so in Australia, you know, whether it's the census or the My Health Records or TOLA and the Assistance and Access Bill, the data retention scheme, there's just so much sort of abuse. And every time I learn more, like when we did, you know, when the data retention hearings were happening, I was completely stunned by what some of, you know, AFP and others were kind of saying in this testimony. You know, how can you ask for trust when you've spent the last decades creating that sort of environment where, you know, bodies just admit almost haphazardly that they violated the terms of that legislation, or they're going beyond the scope, or, you know, they say things like, well, you know, we don't delete the data after the investigation because it could come in handy for another investigation. It's, you know, that sort of treatment of people's rights really erodes trust in a time like this. And using shame and guilt to try and elicit trust is a really horrible idea in a personal relationship. It's a super terrible idea for a government to do. Yeah, so that's my thing. Fix the whole setup. Just admit that you've set yourselves up for disaster at a time like this, and start committing to some bigger systemic changes to make sure that, you know, when you do need data and when you do need people's trust, you can lean on it.
And it's a very sage advice. And the analogy of an abusive relationship with government, the manipulation that you give us your privacy rights or you forego your privacy rights and we'll give you back sports in the pub, cannot be the basis to assert that you are seeking the trust of Australians. It's manipulative at the absolute best. It's abusive probably more realistically.
And yeah, and I mean, if you're talking about, you know, you want people, you're saying you want people to give consent to this app, it's not informed consent because you haven't fully, you know, you're really simplifying what this app can do and what it can deliver. And B, it's not voluntary if it comes with like this weight of society's judgment and this like guilt over, well, you're the reason we can't get back to normal. So yeah, that's very, very shady behavior.
And as you said, there's a more systemic series of steps that need to be taken, I think, before government could properly seek that trust. For example, Australia being the only democratic society, Western democratic society, that lacks an enforceable federal human rights framework. That would be a good start for government to elicit trust. And as you very appropriately identified, the language in the COVID safe legislation around this is very pro-privacy. At least the structure of the legislation seems to have the right words. So the idea that it's not possible to put these words into a place and legislate these kind of protections is a bit farcical now. I'm conscious of time and the promise I've made to our audience, as well as to you, Lucie, not to have this turn into a conversation that I'm sure we could have over several hours, if not days. I did have another question that I'd very quickly like to jump to, because I think you might have an interesting opinion on this. And that question is effectively, what role does the open source community have in this space, in app development or in trust?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best person to speak to the role that open source should have. I mean, I'm a big fan of open source, and I think one of the issues that I've seen myself and the technical community struggle with is the fact that the source code is not being made public. Same with the data management protocols. And, you know, there's this, I think there's an understanding in government that they need to keep these things a secret, when really it would, you know, it would enable us to have a much more either we could just buy in and be happy if we see that everything's working, or it could enable us to have a much more robust discussion. I actually think this sort of secrecy really plays against the government because it raises a lot more questions that potentially, you know, a lot of hypotheticals that people on this side of the fence, the outside, kind of go through. So if you don't already follow someone like Vanessa Teague on Twitter, I would highly recommend it, just because she's been doing a really fantastic job at tracking the technical details of this and modeling, you know, what the similarities are to some of the international applications of digital contact tracing, what we're doing. Yeah, so I think that's great. I wish the open source community was more involved. And I that's something that I think Europe struggles with as well. But they've put very specific guidelines on engagement, specific funding for the open source community to be able to operate more robustly. I think that's where great ideas go to be born. So if the government could be more open about processes and, involving the community, that's where they should be headed. And I mean, a lot of people are unhappy that Amazon ended up with the hosting for this. When you look at the companies who are behind building this app, I think a lot of us are unhappy, and we much more like to see this out in the open.
Yeah, and I think as well from the perspective of security or being able to assert that the app is safe, the open source community gives you many minds to the same issue, which gives you a better solution. So it's not just the trust aspect, it's the ensuring the integrity of the system. Again, conscious of the time, there was a question about media reports saying that the COVID safe app wouldn't be subject to the US Cloud Act, and do we concur with that? I'm not going to offer a view on American law other than to say, firstly, I wouldn't be as concerned about the Cloud Act as I would the Patriot Act. And secondly, the discussion we were having before about changing law through trade agreements and the potential downstream consequences of that echoes here. What we do with the COVID Safe app is say, it is acceptable, firstly, to have secret procurement process. Secondly, that procurement process is done with a foreign company, or at least, although the data's based here, the company isn't, where there are domestic Australian companies that could have offered a similar or potentially better solution. Thirdly, the lack of transparency around this and the fact that US law is US law, not Australian law, should be a reason for us all to pause and think, how confident are we of the Australian government's assurance that the American government wouldn't do something? And finally, the norm that this sets is it's acceptable to give data in this environment, and that contact tracing is something that we should accept and give up because we want to go back to the pub. I think that bargaining arrangement is completely broken. So no, I don't concur that the data is secure and safe and not potentially exposed to other states, particularly because this is a US company, and particularly the way that US law works and the lack of freedoms we have in Australia that Americans might enjoy. Lucie, did you have a comment on that question in terms of the operation of the Cloud Act?
Yeah, just briefly, I'll try to keep this super short. I think this goes back to my comment about it, there need to be structural changes if you're going to demand trust at a time like this. I totally agree with what you said, Angus. Like, how can the Australian government give us a guarantee about what the US will and won't do? I think this is an interesting exercise, and I hope it's an exercise in self-reflection for the Australian government. Because one of the things that they did under TOLA is, give themselves the power to coerce even international companies to do their bidding if they're based in Australia. Other governments have the same powers. Amazon is a US company, just because the data is stored in Australia, and I think that's totally fine for health data. EU has very similar rules, like that data doesn't travel outside of, German data doesn't travel outside of Germany. Polish doesn't travel outside of Poland, fine. But yeah, it's a US company. I think it's great that the government is trying to go out of its way to say it won't, but as you say, totally not within their ability to guarantee that, even on a technical level. The other thing that I would mention, the concern about US Cloud Act, I think totally valid. But the other thing is TOLA itself. One of the things that contact tracing relies on is that Bluetooth capability. And Bluetooth by default, it hasn't always been the way it is. So now when you have Bluetooth on, if you're not using your phone, if it's in the background, it kind of switches off. And that's a privacy protection that's kind of happened as we have shifted into, as we as society have shifted our expectations of privacy. Now, because of contact tracing sort of demands, companies are making changes to API, to the architecture to enable Bluetooth beacons to be active even when you're not using your phone, which makes total sense for the apps, but it creates a different challenge because proximity tracing is being portrayed as better than like location tracing, which it for sure is from a privacy perspective. But if you have something like TOLA and you can kind of coerce some of the companies who are developing this or using this to build it into other systems or enable the functionality for other apps or, software that you may be using, that becomes a scarier concept. And that's one of the things why they've come out with such a strongly worded legislation is they're very aware that that's what people are fearing. But I haven't seen the assurance from the governments, from this government, or actually global governments, to say, we recognize that this sort of proximity tracing being enabled poses a really huge threat. It poses a threat to a lot of different people, domestic people who are vulnerable to domestic violence issues, especially vulnerable, but also political dissidents, you know, anyone who would like to hide who they're meeting on a daily basis from any third party. That's a lot of people. Tax evaders, for instance. I don't know why I'm defending their rights, but they also, you know, there's a lot of people for different reasons who don't want that information shared. And I haven't seen governments say, we are aware this technology is super invasive. We are making sure and working with the companies to make sure that once we no longer need it, it goes back to the way it's been. And I'm terrified that that's not happening, because we can start getting some, you know, you mentioned the Patriot Act, Angus, and that is just a horrible piece of legislation that has been with us for decades. And the reason is they always find a new like threat vector to kind of set up as the boogeyman to keep it around. And I think that's the real fear for people who are in this sort of space, this digital policy space, is what are the repercussions of some of the technologies we're enabling, not just now, not just for contact tracing, but how is this shifting the public debate, and how will this allow surveillance and sort of policing and some of these technologies to thrive into the future?
The only compliment I could give against criticism to the Patriot Act is the Americans are very good at finding acronyms that make things seem a little bit less innocuous than they actually are. But I think it's an interesting discussion, as I said at the start of this, which is fortunate that we've come to this point. This is a global issue, so the conversation has to be not just about what we're doing domestically, but how this all interacts internationally and what the world is really doing beyond our own shores, because it has a direct impact on what happens on our shores. In tying this up though, Lucie, I thought the best way to take us, maybe in the context of the generation to come that I was talking earlier about, is if you could put yourself in the space of you in 2050, looking back on 2020, what advice would you have as a person in 2050 to us now in 2020?
My God, hindsight is always 2020. It's funny that we are in the year 2020. You know, I already, from the beginning of this year to now, I feel like I've learned so much. And, you know, the discussion, the way the public discourse has shifted during that time, you can tell how much people like this has been such a sharp learning curve. So in 2050, I can't even, either this will be such a non-issue and they'll be like, you guys did fine. Or it will, you know, it will be, as I said, a little bit of the 9/11 sort of shift in technologies and capabilities. And so, Lucie of 2050, I'm either really sorry for what we did, or, you know, if there's time travel, please come and tell us just how badly we messed this up.
It's time travel and paradoxes are one of my favorite conversations, but I won't descend into that because that really will be days of conversation. But thank you, Lucie, for the insights and for the conversation. Thank you to everyone participating. The questions are excellent. A big thank you to Robin Doherty and the ThoughtWorks team for powering EFA chats. It's been a good discussion. I look forward to continuing the discussion again in 2 weeks' time. So thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.